Good morning again, everyone. My name is Robert Gott, and it is again my privilege and pleasure to introduce four formidable writers. And they are, for this session, which is called The Art of Omission, Navigating Memoir, which is a great title. In the middle is Jessie Cole, who is a writer of both fiction and memoir. Or are they the same thing? Her memoir, Staying, was longlisted for the 2019 Colin Roderick Award, and she has been shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Award. Not too shabby. Not too shabby. Very bad with left and right. On Jessie's left is Yves Rees. They are an award-winning essayist, academic and memoirist. And as I said in a previous session, choose a lane. Just do one thing. Yves' memoir, All About Yves, was published in 2021 and made an enormous splash, and it is brilliant. They are a lecturer at La Trobe University, and they are widely published in the field of transgender history. On the end here is Shannon Burns. His work has appeared in the Monthly, Meanjin, Australian Book Review and the Sydney Review of Books, and his memoir, Childhood, which also has made a big splash, was published in 2022, and The Guardian called it haunting. I already feel haunted. Thank you very much. Oh, Jayne. Oh, my God. Oh, my giddy aunt. Chairing the panel is Jayne Tuttle. Anyone who was here last night would have seen an astonishing performance from Jayne.
Oh, thank you.
She is the author of two acclaimed volumes of memoir, Paris or Die and My glasses. My Sweet Guillotine. The first of these has been adapted for the stage. She co-owns the bookshop at Queenscliff, which is a fabulous bookshop. And now I'll hand over to Jayne.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, everyone, for coming today to this wonderful festival and to this really interesting subject, the art of omission in memoir. When I first received the invitation to host this panel, I must say I thought, oh, the art of omission, what a tricky and sort of thorny, icky subject, really, and very intriguing. I thought maybe what I'll do is just... my mic. I'd really like to ask, actually, each of the panellists to begin with, what did you feel when you first heard that you were going to participate in a panel about the art of omission in memoir? What did you feel, Shannon, when you first...
Oh, I felt what I always feel. I hope Jayne can guide me in my thinking about the art of omission. It's an interesting subject. I mean, I think that immediately some things spring to mind, forms of omission. So probably a lot of people will think about content that would be omitted, but not emitted, omitted. But there are other aspects. My mind went straight to emotional expressiveness. In my book, one of the things that I was sort of muting a little bit was emotional expressiveness. And so that, I immediately thought of the way that I was omitting that and sort of inviting readers to bring their own sense of the appropriate emotion. I'm not very anxious about what is included and excluded morally.
Yes, right.
I probably thought about it more formally, of what belonged in the book, what didn't belong.
Interesting. Yeah, I think it would be really interesting today to talk about the process of omission as a book is being composed, and especially a work of memoir or creative nonfiction, you know, how do you start, how do you work? And I think we'll get to that. And also those minefields of what happens when we have to feel we have to exclude things for certain reasons. So that's great. How about you, Jessie? Did you?
I think I don't know. I felt a huge wave of anxiety that I would that I would just not be able to contain myself. I feel like this is a sort of panel. In some ways, it's a dream panel because it's all the things you haven't spoken about at other times, but also the whole point of omitting things is that you have chosen to be circumspect, and that's not my strongest suit in the real. Anyway, we'll see how we go.
It's very interesting because you are normally on a panel to talk about what's in your book.
Yeah, that's right.
Not what's not in your book. And you've made very conscious choices to not put certain things in. So they're gone. You don't have to think it. So thanks to Jo, we're all sitting here and we're going to be looking at those things today.
Squirming.
Yeah.
Microscope.
Did you feel squirmy when you saw omission as a topic?
I did, but I think as I often do when confronted with emotionally complex situations, I perhaps like Shannon put my intellectual hat on as a coping strategy, and I started thinking about the art of omission, I suppose in relation to the genre of memoir and particularly trans memoir, the genre I was writing in. Because I think when you're sort of working in such an established genre space, what you include or not include is you're always kind of in conversation with the genre itself. Like, to what extent are you reproducing the norms and the conventions of the genre? And so my mind, I suppose, went to the ways in which I'd tried to kind of, I suppose, resist some of the conventions of trans memoir and, I suppose, traditional coming out memoir more broadly in my work. And as a way to, I suppose, critique the kind of established norms of trans and queer expression. So, yeah, I think I went to specific details of things I'd left out, but more how I tried to shape the shape of the memoir in relation to that kind of genre.
Wow. And so in terms of the genre, do you, Jessie, being somebody who has written both memoir and fiction, did you find that the idea of omission and things that you were going to cut, and was that different for you writing fiction and non-fiction?
I think it's definitely different. I feel memoir writing is a lot more, you feel like you're trapped in the compressed space in a sense, because you're trapped by the reality of your circumstances and the reality. I mean, I know that we can all interpret that in different ways, but with fiction, that's not the case. And so for me, it's quite, the main difference is more a feeling when you're doing it, which is fiction feels expansive, whereas memoir feels contracted. Yeah. And there's a lot more. I think for me, memoir is a lot more difficult because it involves all of those other questions and those other decisions around, what can go in and what can't, and what is the story and what isn't. Because the life is so vast, but you're really culling so much to fit it into a book. So. Like more than half of the project in some ways is figuring out what makes it in. Yeah.
Fascinating. I feel this urge to, because we're already talking about omission before we've talked about the actual books, I thought I might just introduce just a little note about what I wrote about each of the books. Shannon Burns' Childhood is a book about a boy who never had that at all. It's an unsparing testament to being and becoming, an eloquently spare, masterfully depicted account of a child growing up with abuse and neglect, and ultimately the saving grace of reading. So if you haven't read this book, you have to go and get it. Every single one of you have to go get it. Actually, all 3/4 of these books are so moving, and they're the perfect... I can really see why Jo chose this subject for these books, because they're the perfect example of books that are written with so much inside of them, and yet this absolute spare... there's no fat at all. There's no sense of indulgence or self. Everything is just cut back to the bare minimum. So Desire, Jessie Cole has written 2 memoirs. Her first, Staying, is absolutely incredible. I'm going to talk more about her second, Desire, today. But Desire is an exploration of the very nature of desire, a raw and self-effacing story of vulnerability and strength, loss and regeneration. When an attraction to an older man precipitates a battle between Cole's rationality and emotional fragility, she's forced to confront the deepest parts of herself and her past. So again, this book is just chock full of experience and investigation. And Yves' book, All About Yves, is a journey of rebecoming, laying bare the messiness of bodies, gender and identity. Yves weaves extensive research with personal experience to create a moving, insightful and revelatory read, sharing the challenges and joys of being transgender in Australia today, and what the trans experience can teach us all about what it means to be human. I think I just wanted when I read these books, I actually read some of these books before I was asked to do this talk. But one of the things that came to mind when I thought about Omission is Hemingway's his theory of omission, about the iceberg. I'll read actually. He says, if a writer of prose knows enough about what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows. And the reader, if the writer is writing truly enough, it's a bit convoluted, will have a feeling of those things as strongly as though the writer had stated them. The dignity of movement of an iceberg is due to only 1/8 of it being above water. So anything you know, you can eliminate, and it only strengthens your iceberg. I want to talk about the process of writing these. So you've got all this material from your life. Yves, how did you start? Are you like Michelangelo would start with a big lump of marble or stone, and he would chip out the artwork? It was inside of there. Do you work like that with a bank of work and then chip it back, or do you start by omitting and actually just lay your work down part by part?
Yeah, definitely the latter. I'm not a kind of vomit on the page and then edit back writer. I edit extensively as I go, like sentence by sentence, word by word, which is perhaps ill-advised and can feel really excruciating at times because it means I write quite slowly. But the first draft is therefore quite polished when I finally get to a first draft. So I think for me, the kind of initial step in, working out how to, squash the enormity of my life into a book was to admit that I didn't want to write a kind of conventional narrative memoir that started in my childhood. Going back to what I said earlier about me being in conversation with the kind of the norms of trans memoir, I was very conscious that there's a kind of, unspoken expectation to write about your childhood trauma and your closeted trauma and, the pain you suffered at not being able to come out and so on. And there's a little bit of that in the book, but I didn't want to, it didn't actually feel true to my own experience, and it felt like I was would be just kind of offering myself up to a sort of voyeuristic gaze of readers in ways that just didn't sit right to me. And it also felt quite boring. I actually kind of hate memoirs that start in childhood and go through a whole life. I think the best memoirs are always a kind of, I'm not talking about yours, Shannon, of course, because yours doesn't go through the whole life. It's just your childhood. I think all the best memoirs, Shannon knows I love his book. I shortlisted it for a prize. they're like a little slice of a life, whether that is just childhood or, for me was later. So that initial decision of deciding not to kind of do childhood, to start later and to be much more thematic was the kind of initial editing culling of my life. And once I'd made that decision, I kind of quite quickly had kind of, I suppose, particular topics that I wanted to cover. And they were sort of the organising principles for certain chapters and themes. And then I sort of very painstakingly wrote my first drafts from there.
Wow. You do that. You don't go through from the beginning and create a sort of, sentimental, journey from, the child. But you do give these gorgeous little insights into your childhood, which are like the tip. Actually, there's a beautiful thing that John McPhee, who was one of the pioneers of creative fiction, a Pulitzer Prize winner, he says this great thing about, a writer needs to deliver only a few words and images so that you can allow the reader to see in their mind's eye the landscapes. For example, an autumnal landscape, we just need corn shocks, pheasants and an early frost, and we're there. And you give us this beautiful picture of, this summer's day in your family home. It's you're 10, you're hot, your brother's sitting with his shirt off, and you sit with your shirt off, and it's uncomfortable. And it's just this beautiful little picture, and we get your whole childhood from that image. It's such a great example of omitting all that other stuff and just giving it that little picture, and we get it. Fantastic. And what about you, Jessie? So how do you work?
I think this project is really unique because I had pitched it. I got an Australian Council grant to write this book, and I had pitched it as a book of essays, personal essays exploring attachment trauma and adult love relationships. And I had this idea of who I was, I think we probably all do this a bit as writers, but where I wanted to be the kind of writer who would write a really smart, analytical, kind of well-researched book that would just, I guess, show me in this particular light, that I would be that person. That was probably my aim with this project, like a massive interest area, and I'd been reading around that kind of stuff for a long time. So anyway, so I this was the idea, and I got a grant to write the book, and did an enormous amount of research into attachment theory and all sorts of things like that. And so I had like a running project, which was like my book of personal essays, and then I had all the writing that I was doing about the relationship that I was having. And I just assumed that all the writing that was in this folder that you might have described as the private folder was private, and it was just me sort of nutting out stuff while I was working on this other big project, but they weren't really connected. But it became clear over time that the private folder was much bigger and more developed and more alive. Like, it was where all the life in the project was. And so I just kind of had this horror realisation, halfway through the project that was the project. So I suppose in terms of omission, the whole project was the omitted part in the beginning of realising what the project was. And so in some ways it's like a really beautiful way to write, because it's not that writing that's in the private folder. You never ever expect to be judged on it, and you don't have any kind of anxiety about how it will be received because it's private. And then the sort of horror movement from private folder to actual project that occurred for me halfway through. And I haven't used this as a writing technique before. I don't really recommend it as a way to go, but that's what I did.
Well, it makes such an interesting book because you have that research side of it, and actually your character then actually goes and reads the 500-page document on attachment theory, which is such a gorgeous part of the book. But also, and I think this is the same with your book, Yves, this aspect of the, you know, research and history and then also combining it with your personal experience just gives us such a access into these worlds, these territories that you've explored in such a enjoyable and deep and moving way. I really love that. What about you, Shannon? Like, how did you go about writing childhood? Are you a spewer and a chipper, a sculptor, or are you more of a placer and a emitter as you go?
So the genesis of the book was really varied, and so there was lots of little pieces coming together, and I'm not sure that I could say anything general about the process of writing it, except that it began as a question. Could I write certain aspects of childhood experience in a way that I found pleasing? Because it was material that wasn't to my taste. So this is not, it wasn't the kind of thing that I read by choice. You know, by this time I'm an academic.
Yeah.
I'm working on, you know, mostly late modernist fiction. And so that those are the things, you know, I'm really, Proust is what I'm into. So if we're talking about remembrance,
Yeah.
I want that very kind of refined, elaborate, distant, socially complex, funny, but you have to sort of know, a sophisticated text, effectively. Whereas the material that I was working with seemed extremely brutal and simple in lots of ways. So there was just a question of, so I have this material, can I write it in a way that would that was acceptable? I wasn't even aiming for good, just something that would be acceptable to me. And then from there, I remember reading out the early parts of it at an event in Adelaide, and being surprised by the emotional power of it. By that time, it had just become a fairly abstracted thing to me. I'd worked over it formally, but I read it out, and suddenly I realised that it had some emotional force, and then that was the response to it as well. And so there was quite a long period of people saying, "You should write that book," and me politely nodding and smiling and evading that until other things came into play. It was a grind mostly, so I didn't like it. I didn't like the process of writing it. It was really just a strong aversion. I thought I could do it much faster than I did, so I agreed to do it. I thought because I didn't understand myself well enough. Also, I didn't understand how miserable the story was, because that's not. I didn't really. All I carried around in my head were just little funny things that I could say to people about my. But it's just a way of kind of jolting them or making them uneasy, which I took some pleasure in. But then sitting down and lining up event after event, I had to deal with the fact that this was. This really was a book that I didn't want to write and that I didn't want to inhabit. So then also, I mean, when you talk about Omission, I spent quite a lot of myself on the first half of the book, and I realised, I'm not sure if I should say this, but I thought, I've given enough here. Maybe I'm going to draw back a little bit. I'm going to keep some things. And I kept a lot. And I think that this was partly a desire to keep parts of myself in reserve, but then also, I'm a writer. I have to keep material
Yeah.
in reserve to use in different ways, you know. So in terms of process, it was chaotic, exploratory, and a lot of resistance.
Really interested in this idea of those parts that you really don't want to write, the parts that you want to omit so badly. And a lot of, you know, writing from your own experience and being, you know, very astute readers and academics, like you're used to having a bit of distance from yourself, and you would like to keep that, i.e. the idea of writing a nice academic piece, put it out there, no sort of icky... how did you feel about, you know, I know there's been a few times when I've been writing and I've said to my husband, oh God, I've got to that point where I can't write that bit. And he's like, well, that's the bit you have to write. That's the book. Did you feel like that? Like when you got to that place where you thought, okay, I've done enough, I've got no more to do, going into that next place, how was that to actually write the bit you wanted to omit more than anything?
It was unpleasant.
And do you think that was the book? That was actually the best parts of the book?
No. Well, I would say actually, you know, things changed for me. So I came up with formal solutions to some of the discomfort or the wariness that I had. In terms of, I wrote the first half of the book is in first person present tense. And it was via that voice, so this is fiction, really. I'm pretending to speak with the voice of a child, but it's, you know, anchored to memory. That meant that I could, some of the reticence that I had could fall away, and I could just speak through the child, and I could some of the things that I wouldn't have written can come through in the voice because the voice of a child has more room to move. It can also be mistaken, you know, misperceive, and it can be, and a reader can say, oh, this is a child speaking. How do I take this? You know.
So just to explain it, in childhood, the voice flips from the first person narrative into the third person, which is just a very amazing, you know, interesting way to read. You don't really notice it happening, but suddenly you're looking at it from a different perspective. And that was your tool, was it, to get from that part where you felt like you'd done enough into the next?
Yes,
phase.
yeah. That was the formal device that I used, where I could, instead of inhabiting that, I could look at it still through his point of view, but with some distance. Also, I have great sympathy, or at least at the point where I was writing the book, great sympathy for children, you know, 1 to 10, and I don't think I was yet so sympathetic to teenagers. I didn't have a teenager yet. In my mind, teenagers are gross. So when I was writing about myself as a teenager, you know, I think I preferred to stand outside him to a degree.
Jessie, I need to ask you about, I know that, it's really interesting that you were talking about the personal stuff that was put to the side, and then I know you've mentioned that with Desire, so Desire, one of the through narrative really is about a relationship that Jessie had with an older man, and a relationship that was at a slight distance, which is actually really appealing to Jessie because of the trauma of her previous experiences in a marriage and as a family member, and experiencing great trauma and tragedy. And I know, just in talking to Jessie the other day, she actually mentioned that there was a point where you were trying to keep your distance so much that actually you went a bit too far?
Yeah, I suppose I had like one thing in mind in terms of the portrayal of the relationship, which was that the older man, like I wanted, I think it's quite common for women when they're involved in sort of ambivalent interactions where they do a lot of thinking about what's going on for the man, like why are they making these choices and what's happening with their psychology and what happened to them in childhood and like why is this occurring? And I just really, really wanted the book to not do that, to not spend any time sort of like grappling with why the older man would be doing what he was doing, and I just wanted to turn it around, and not just as a literary exercise, but as a sort of personal exercise. Like turn it around and think about like why am I making these choices? What is it about this situation that attracts me so much? Like really turn the mirror on me. So that was sort of like a guiding principle, and I also, it was important to the older man that he wasn't identifiable. That was his main sort of, thing that always came up whenever we discussed it. He didn't want to be identifiable. So really what that meant was that there was no information in the text at all about anything about him, anything about his life, anything about his personality, really. And I mean, there was like dialogue between us where you could kind of ascertain the way that he spoke or things like that, but it was just very, that part of the text was so minimal. And when I really never shared this text with anyone because it was just such a sort of private matter. So it kind of went from just between me and me to the publisher. And when the publisher read it, I realised from their feedback that they really thought that the older man, like number one, they thought that we'd had a completely sexual relationship with no emotional content, and that they thought I didn't know anything about him. Like because none of his detail was in the text, they just assumed that I was unaware of his like life biographical detail. And also I think they thought that he had behaved really badly because I hadn't included anything that allowed you to see that he had been vulnerable in the situation that we're in. And so then I realised I hadn't been aware of that at all in the text from just like my view of it, because obviously I knew the circumstance even if it wasn't in the text. So then I decided to go back and not omit but actually add a whole series of tiny, tiny little fragments that showed that he was quite vulnerable and he felt quite precarious in the scenario that we were in. And I really resisted doing that because I had thought that he wouldn't like to be seen as vulnerable. But I realised that if the reader didn't get to see that, then he just looked awful, and he wasn't at all awful. So it was just a funny feedback sort of thing. Like you really did have to have a reader to realise what was required. Yeah.
Isn't it amazing how you're still trying to make him feel okay?
I know. Yeah.
I find that fascinating because so basically what you did was you omitted so hard that actually the character, so there's like a line between, trusting the Hemingway thing of, well, if I know it, the reader's going to know it, and actually giving us enough to feel that character. And I think you did that so beautifully. It's so delicate. Just these little touches of little things that he says that say so much about the complexity of this relationship and the difficulty and this tenderness at the same time, even though there's this distance. Eve, I really want to know, was there a part of the book that you either omitted and regretted, or was there a bit that you thought about omitting and you sort of, were there any parts that you were really unsure about, or that maybe someone said you need to omit, an editor or a publisher?
Or a family member.
Or a family member. That's a great subject.
Yeah, I mean, on this topic generally about omission, I mean, where it really showed up, that the complexities of what to omit and what to include for me in this project was really about writing about other people.
Yeah.
I don't actually write about other people all that much, but I do write about, you know, coming out to my parents and my brother and his family and friends. And I found that an incredibly fraught and complex process. And I'm still kind of dealing with the fallout of it. You know, this was my first memoir. I kind of went into it quite naively. I wrote most of it during lockdowns. So I was sort of in this little bubble where it was just me. I wasn't, you know, kind of similar maybe, Jessie, to your private folder where you weren't kind of anticipating readers. And so I wrote pretty, without a kind of much of an censor, I suppose. And then once I'd sort of written the manuscript and I was on quite a tight publication schedule, I had to go, oh, you know, now I need to work out how I'm going to deal with this question of, you know, navigating the ethics of writing about other people, writing about events that are quite recent, people who are still in my life. And so I sort of, you know, everyone who I'd written about, I showed them the relevant sections before the manuscript was kind of finalised with the publisher. And people had really strong reactions to that. It was really an illuminating process of how uncomfortable many people find it to be written about. And what I sort of concluded was people don't so much dislike being written about because you're saying something negative or pejorative per se. It's more the fact of being turned into a character in someone else's story. That I think, you know, we all have main character syndrome. We all walk around narrating our life as, you know, we're the hero, we're the protagonist of our story. Everyone else is a minor character to us, to our great, you know, hero narrative. And then when you find yourself, you know, in a one-page scene in someone else's story, it's incredibly confronting to the ego, to be kind of sidelined and used almost as a narrative tool in that way. You know, I did do that. Like, I have scenes where I talk about coming out and people using my new name. And I was very consciously introducing those characters in that scenes to make particular points about my emotional journey. And yeah, people really hated that. Actually, in the wake of writing this book, you know, this all kind of happened in a very rushed, chaotic, compressed form, and I sort of didn't get a chance to fully tease out the complexities of it at the time. But since then, I've kind of become obsessed with this question of what it means to write about other people in life writing. And I developed a kind of a writing workshop on the ethics of memoir, which I've taught a few times, which was basically an excuse for me to read extensively on this question. And it generates really polarised opinion. You know, there's sort of one school of memoirists who are sort of like, you know, fuck it, it's your life, write whatever you want. If someone doesn't like how you wrote about them, they should have treated you better. That's a kind of dominant line. There's other schools of thought that's like, it's, you know, some people say it's always an act of violence to write about someone else. Where I've sort of landed with it, though, is I think it's neither inherently kind of, you know, okay nor violent, but it will change your relationship with someone. No matter how positive, how negative you write, how much you write, the mere act of turning a living person in your life into a character on a page will inherently transform your relationship with that person. And I certainly didn't realise that going into memoir. I think probably many memoirists don't. And yeah, I'm still kind of working out what that means for my life, that, you know, the things I chose not to omit, the tricky emotional moments that I think were core to the book. In some circumstances, I've basically lost relationships as a result of not omitting that. But in other cases, it's really enhanced my relationships. So, for instance, with my mother, the process, you know, she's an incredibly private person. She was appalled at the idea of being written about. But the process of her, you know, consenting to that, reading the scenes between us in the book, I think it kind of defamiliarised me for her and our relationship. You know, I think many parents, of course, you know, have a vision of their children as they were as children, and it's hard for the child to kind of change and evolve in the parent's eyes. And I think the process of her seeing me as a character on the page and her in relation to me as a character brought fresh eyes to our relationship and to who I was as a person, which prompted all these kind of bigger conversations which have enormously enriched our relationship.
Amazing. It's just don't be friends with a writer. I realise that it's simple, or don't give birth to one, because I think that I know that it's so hard, isn't it? Because there's no way you can write anything, fiction or non, without in some way using your experience of people around you. And I mean, I know Helen Garner says her friends would get upset with her if they included her in, or them, you know, any sort of aspect of them in her books, and then they'd get worsely angry if they weren't in the books. So you're fucked, basically. Oh, look, I have so many more questions to ask. You can see I've highlighted 1,000 questions, but I think it's such an interesting subject, and I know you'll have lots of questions to ask yourselves. So I'd love to throw it out to you. If you don't have anything, there's no pressure. There's a backup load. Anybody like to ask a question? Yes, what would you like to ask?
Thank you to the writers for their disclosure. The thing that has struck me in over a quarter of a century of curating a collection of photos is the power of the publisher. And I was curious to know, in the context of the things that you talked about, the ethics of writing and omission, to what extent are the publishers the omission police? And if I read or go back to all the acknowledgements in the back of all the books I've read, nobody is, and no publisher is ever going to print it anyway, nobody's saying these people are bastards. But they must be. And then I go all the way back to Ada Cambridge and Rosa Parade and Catherine Helen Spence, you know, back in the middle of the 19th century. They were bastards. Are they still there?
Great question. So what is the relationship with your publisher? And did your publishers have a particular idea of what your books were going to be? And did you live up to that?
I think
Were they harsh?
I think that maybe there was a slightly different understanding of what my book would be. My book was probably going to be an exploration of class in its conception of the impact of class, connecting to literature in some way.
Which it is, no?
Yes, but it became much more kind of focused on the personal. I think initially it was going to say something about the world. Instead, if it does it quite more indirectly. It doesn't do it explicitly.
I think it does.
It does powerfully and humanly.
But I was surprised by the freedom that my publisher gave me, and I wondered when I submitted the manuscript if there would be bits where they would say you shouldn't include this, but that never happened at any point. And so I was my own omission police. Yeah.
Not bastards? Text publishing?
No.
What about you, Jessie?
I have to say I feel like my publishers really went into bat for me with this book because there were lots of reasons that they could have thought it was too difficult, and they really, really didn't. So I'm amazed by how much they stood behind me in that scenario. I do think, though, that I also got the most brutal and honest feedback one could ever receive. So my editorial process and because it had never been seen by anyone and they were the first sort of seers.
Who was the first seers?
Well, Michael and Penny from Text as well.
Right, yeah. So they gave you the brutal feedback?
Yeah,
or,
just
right,
all
yeah.
that stuff around their vision of what my relationship had been based on their reading of the text, which is exactly like the text was what it was just very, very disconcerting for me. It was very, very shocking. And I went back and revised it quite considerably based on their take on what the book was. But I really also deeply appreciate that, because if I hadn't had that, then I would have published something that I couldn't truly see. So their willingness to be brutally honest with me about what they thought the text was, they were still happy to publish it that way. But, it was like they really reflected back at me what I had written, and I could see the holes and sort of, I'm really deeply appreciative, because it was really hard, but I think it lifted the work. Yeah.
So their brutality and clarity really made it
and
the best book it can
also
be.
they went into bat. Like, it was like I knew that they valued it, but it was quite difficult. Yeah.
Interesting. What about you, Yves? Was that a good experience?
I was published with Allen and Unwin, and they were also incredibly supportive. And I think, I was much more neurotic about what to include or omit than they were. There was one point in which I had, in this kind of quite rushed process, I had feedback from someone in the book that that person really wanted me to omit certain material and change the scene. And so I had to plead with my publisher for, can I have another week or two to, delay the process to do this. And they agreed. But I think they were quite almost bemused by my eagerness not to upset people.
Wow.
I think they just wanted to be like, just tell it all, lay it all out. It's your story, screw them. And I've actually had public conversations since with my publisher, Jayne Tuttle, where she said that she was bemused, but that going through that process with me has led her to reflect on Memoir and writing other people, and kind of led her views to evolve on those questions.
Interesting. So she's a bit more sensitive to the process for people, is she, of that tricky area?
Perhaps.
That's great.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes.
I'm just interested, all the authors have said it's quite difficult writing a memoir. So why do you actually do it?
Because we're masochists.
Very publicly, because obviously there's difficult stories to be told. Why do you choose to do that?
Great question. Why put yourself through it?
I would say that the difficulty is discovered, well, in my case, discovered in the process more than being aware of it at the outset. So my book came about after writing some personal essays, which I found really easy to write. I just sort of dipped in and out of them. They took a few days. I mean, there was some polishing that happened afterwards. And it seemed breezy. But then converting that process into writing a book, it was just weightier. You're lugging this thing around with you all the time. It was. I thought that I could just have lots of breezy moments, which would convert into a book. But that's not that. I discovered that wasn't the case. Yeah.
I think for me, it's quite. Because of my circumstances, I lost two members of my immediate family in my teenage years to suicide, and it was just that experience was so incredibly isolating and so I think when I first started writing Memoir, I was writing to claim space in my own world, and it felt really, really it just felt really powerful to be able to do that. I never ever expected to be published or expected anyone to read it or anything like that. But just the it's like I'd become so isolated, I'd become so quiet inside myself that I had become voiceless. And so it was a real process of reclaiming the right to speak. even just to myself, like even just in my own head. And so for me, it sort of retains that intense kind of like power and also like sustenance or you know, it which just exists completely separately to what it feels like to be published. Yeah, and so with both of the books, I feel, even though they're really quite different, but just that sense of being allowed to talk, that was just monumental for me. Yeah.
The reaching out of a memoir, I'm sure that you've all read memoirs before that have made you feel a lot less lonely in your experience, to read someone else's true experience of trauma or grief or, you know, the things that we go through. And I think there's something so remarkable about these 3 books that made me feel more human. And they're so generous from that place of, you can feel the struggle of the writer, and you do sometimes think, God, oh my God, this person has put their absolute still beating heart on the page. God, they've been through so much to do this, but I'm so grateful to read these experiences because they do, and I'm sure that especially people who specifically are experiencing these things would find them extremely helpful.
Yeah, that was similar to Jessie. I think that was kind of my motivation as well, that I, you know, because my book kind of starts with me realising at the age of 30 that I was trans and sort of covering what happens after that. It's really written, I think, as a gift in return to the trans memoirs I had read leading up to that point that allowed me to recognise myself. You know, I spent sort of my entire teenage years and my 20s feeling, you know, really lonely at a kind of existential level, like knowing there was something off about my relationship to my body and my gender and myself, and feeling enormous kind of distress and angst, but not being able to put words or language or concepts to it. And that was an incredibly isolating way to live. And reading other trans and gender diverse writers, you know, hearing their stories, even reading their content on Instagram, you know, gave me a sense of connection that I'd never felt before in my life. It allowed me to see myself reflected on the page in someone else's story. And I think in a way, you know, Hugh Mackay was talking last night about the importance of connection and community. And I think, you know, he was talking about eye contact and being in the same space together. But I think reading someone else's story and recognising part of your life in their story is also one of the most profound human moments of connection we can have. And I'd got so much of that from reading other people's stories, and I wanted to give that back.
And I think sometimes stories like ours, maybe, are hard to impart in a personal like yours, for sure, Shannon, but, you know, in a conversation with someone. I mean, how long would you have to be in conversation with someone to be able to share the depth of that experience? So it's sort of like, in a sense, reading, you don't have the eye contact and all of that sort of stuff, but it's better because, you know, otherwise it's untenable. And you learn that when you carry a story like that no one can hear. So like in a conversation, but they can hear it if you've shared it, you know, like if they get to read it in their private space. And yeah, it just makes it like possible for the sharing.
Yeah. And you can really go, like, in other art forms like short story or film or theatre, or, you know, you don't have that space of time to really go into an experience and go back and really examine it from all these different angles. And so that's the idea of the time spent can really be an incredibly exciting and healing and, you know, revelatory thing. That's what makes books so great.
Yeah, I would just chime in terms of one of the things that one of the impetus or the motivations behind writing the book was a desire to explain why I am the way I am. And I'm not even convinced that there are easy causal
Yeah.
arguments to be made around this. But I was aware at a certain point. You know, I grew up in quite impoverished settings and chaotic settings. There's violence, there's institutional care, there's all this sort of stuff going on. And I land in a very middle class world, academically, artsy. My wife's a lawyer. My kids' parents all have middle class jobs. So I've landed in this very specific world, and all of the experiences before that have almost no connection to this. But they are part of what makes me weird in my particular ways. And so there's a desire to explain why I find some things that other people experience as harrowing, I find funny.
Yes. Yeah.
And so just these temperamental differences, which also allows me, because I got to see where all of that came from for me, it allows me to kind of understand that their experiences are quite different. It makes sense for them not to find this thing funny. So
you have your own unique experience, and you're going specifically into your story as deeply as you possibly can. Creates this. It seems to be that the deeper you go into your story, the more universal it seems to become in some weird way, and also your reaction to it could be completely different from one person to the next.
Yeah, I love that. That's something that I love about. It's something I cherish, is the different responses that people have to the same thing.
Are you going to write like this again?
I think I prefer fiction.
Fiction. Okay. So from the research academia to the memoir to fiction. I love it. Okay, who else? Yes.
I wondered if you could speak to why you chose to omit the actual landing in that middle class world. Like, I know it's framed around childhood, but I sort of got to the end of your book and was like wondering how that then felt, because you've set up literature as this sort of salvation, and then the subsequent steps that happen, I presume, in your early adulthood, of then inhabiting this new world weren't part of it. And did you ever consider extending your childhood into your early 20s in this book?
Yeah, there was a sort of negotiation around how far things would extend. My idea of the book really was that the frame wouldn't be there so much. It would be the meat of the story, the first person and then the third person. But that would be effectively a fiction. You know, it would read like a novel. Also, there was. I think that my editor and publisher liked the idea of readers knowing that there was a happy ending. I was really attracted to I land this boy at sort of 17, and anything could happen to him. I had a really strong sense that it could go anywhere, and that was attractive to me. But that wasn't the book that I agreed to write effectively. And yeah, also I do understand some of. So when I was talking about the sort of miscommunications or the not fitting or your sort of uneasy relationship with being in this different class setting, it's also a minor thing to me. You know, it's not a large difficulty, so it didn't strike me as being all that interesting. So there were aspects of that I wrote about, which I then omitted.
Yeah, there's a great omission. I feel like that was a great omission. Like, it really makes us, as the reader, there's a real faith in the reader to sit back and think, now how has this person who has experienced this life as a child moved from this to the next? And we do tend to put together that it's the reading that has saved, the reading that has kept this. And also, the reading is the thing that takes you from one social class to the next, doesn't it? You're able to get into university because you're you've read so widely and are, you know, articulate enough to pass the exams. And
Yes, but it's also catastrophic. You know, it turns you into a certain kind of person.
Joe, I feel like do we have time for maybe one more question, or it's just after 12:30.
There's one
more.
up there,
We're
yeah.
allowed one more. You choose.
Oh, I think this person
Yes,
up there
yes.
had their hand up.
I'm interested in the tension between omission and authenticity, and how it could almost lead to revisionism. I think of Cheryl Kernow and Gareth Evans, and when she wrote, she was protecting and didn't write about the affair in her biography, so as if it didn't happen. And we do things to protect other people, but then where is this creating another story, almost a revisionism, somehow something that we like to portray, and also with violence, you don't want to talk about ugly violence because you may want to respect the dead and not talk about something. So when you don't talk about something, when you choose to omit, what does it, is there a new story and not a story that isn't really...
Almost are you writing by you're actually saying something by omitting something. Yeah.
Out the word revisionism because I read things and I know that people, and I think, hey, that didn't happen because I've known this all my life. Why are you writing like that?
All these writers have written revisionist histories of their experience, and because by nature of writing to begin with.
Yeah, I think for me at least, the process of writing a memoir teaches you how fictional a memoir is. Not only in things like, recreating certain scenes and recreating dialogue that you couldn't possibly imagine word for word, but, you're crafting a story, and you could have, I think any of us could have told the stories of this material in our life any number of other ways. We could have flipped the narrative so many other ways. There is no one true story that, therefore gets challenged by a revisionist alternative. The historian in me also thinks very strongly that the act of turning data into story is always a deeply political and ethical act. There is never any inherent story that should attach to any collection of data. We always make choices. Often those choices are unconscious, and we can get tricked into thinking that there is an inherent story which must attach to certain data, but I don't think that's ever the case. And that doesn't mean, we're behaving unethically by acknowledging that we're crafting narrative and omitting facts which emphasise one aspect of the story and not others. We're just being honest about what's going on and what always goes on.
I really liked in the session before us, Ben Walter was talking about. I think he was talking about, like, I suppose when he knew that a story was done or what he was aiming to do, and he was writing the short fiction, and he said it just feels whole. And I think that it's like, I don't think any of us would be sort of deluded enough to believe that we were capturing the real truth or anything like that. Like we know, I think memoir writers know that's not really possible. But I think you're doing something that's sort of more aesthetic in a sense, like you're reaching towards a feeling of wholeness in some way, whatever that might be. It's quite instinctive. It's not even for me. It's not intellectualized even. It's just like, you've finally like shaped it in a way where you can take a breath and it feels whole. So I would bring that kind of judgment to it, which is a similar sort of judgment that I would bring to writing fiction. Rather than tussling with like questions of would this be seen to be an authentic representation of exactly what happened.
I think we need to wrap it up. We could talk for days. It's such an interesting subject. It really gets at the heart of how we write, how we read, how we perceive what we're reading. Thanks so much, Jo, for this great subject. And thank you all for coming. And please, I cannot recommend each of these 3 books more. They're completely different, completely unique, giving these 3 very different perspectives on 3 very different aspects of life. So these guys will be signing books after this, and I hope you all have a fantastic day at the festival. Thanks. Bravo.